Welcome to the Motherhood Tribe. We are your hosts, Erica, Katie, Valerie, and Jackie. Come join us as we talk all things motherhood, marriage, and just plain life. We have learned the importance of having a tribe from each other, and now we want to share that with you. We're so happy you're here. Come join our tribe. Hello, mamas. Welcome back. We are so excited for this episode. So this is the last week of April, and April is actually Autism Awareness Month. April 2nd was officially Autism Awareness Day, and in honor of that, we have our guest JaNae and her son Brady, who are what I consider experts on autism. JaNae is a mother of 4 children, and her oldest was diagnosed with autism when he was 2-ish, and Brady is now 25. Right? Brady?
Probably by the time this releases, yeah.
Almost 25. And he is thriving in the community. And we're really excited to have Brady here to kind of give us a perspective on autism as an adult and kind of what he went through to be where he's at, to be able to support himself and go to school and do these great things and kind of get a cool perspective from that. So we're so excited to have them. JaNae, do you want to give us a little bit further background on you and your family? And then you can also introduce Brady in a little bit more detail.
Sure. Okay. So my husband and I have 4 children. Brady is our oldest. He has a sister just younger than him that is almost 23. She is developmentally delayed and deaf. And then we have an 18-year-old that's about to graduate and a 14-year-old. And those are all girls. My degree is in human development. That's what I studied in college. And interestingly, I remember a class, this was in the early 90s, where we learned about various disabilities. And in my textbook, I can still remember that on the left-hand side of the page, there was one paragraph talking about autism in this whole textbook. And I was really excited to learn about what autism was. And after reading the paragraph, I still had no idea. And I think that was because most people...
Yeah, no one had an idea, maybe.
It was such an anomaly. It wasn't very well known. Okay, so Brady is one of the most independent young adults I know. He is living at home right now, but he has been living...
Because college is expensive.
This is true. But he has earned his way through college. He's paid for every bit of college on his own. He has his own car. He paid for every penny on his own. He is extremely responsible. He takes care of all of life's challenges, everything that comes at him. And he does it with a really unique flair. He has this wry sense of humor and sees life in a very unique way. He's simple. He's not caught up in what is popular or what other people might think of him. He has this freedom that I think most of us seek and fall short in finding. He enjoys life. He's brilliant. He has this vocabulary that drives his sisters bonkers because
yes it does.
He's got an earbud in all the time. He's constantly listening to podcasts
and audiobooks.
He's just an information sponge, and I think really enjoys life, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, there can be improvements here and there, but...
So let's talk about diagnoses. I know before you were saying that there weren't many that were diagnosed. Now there are much more. Do you want to kind of elaborate on that for us?
You'll see a lot of variability in the statistics, and that's because they're changing all the time. But I think the most recent national statistic is 1 in 54 children now are being diagnosed with autism. But it could be closer to about 1 in 40 kids. Mm-hmm. And that is just the children that are being diagnosed. That does not include those that are going undiagnosed. So
right.
It's
pretty common.
So the increase of diagnosis doesn't mean that there are more people with autism than there were in the past. It means that we're identifying more. There's still the same number of people with autism. We're just able to identify it better.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to ask. So let's talk about what is autism really quickly.
Yeah, so I believe that the DSM-5 identifies 3 main symptoms of autism. Uh-huh. We have 2 of them right here. Mainly deficits in social communication, and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities.
So I'm curious, with the deficits in social communication, what does that look like? Can you kind of maybe paint the picture of what that translates to in real life?
Yeah, and actually just reading the criteria, I feel like does not paint a very clear picture of what autism looks like. If you met somebody with autism, these are not the things that you might just pop up in the normal. Deficit in social communication can mean a million things. There's as many definitions of that as for as many people as they are. It can look like poor eye contact. Doesn't mean that everybody with autism has poor eye contact. Deficits in social reciprocity would look like, not being able to maintain a very good back and forth conversation. If I say something, is it going to fall flat, or are you going to respond in kind? And we have a back and forth conversation around the same subject and sharing an emotional moment together. And then there's having poor nonverbal skills, not able to recognize a facial expression or not able to recognize the underlying parts of conversation. So
like social cues and things that's regular back and forth doesn't come easily or naturally for them. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, so from an autistic perspective, the whole not being able to pick up on social cues, it's like everyone else gets to have subtitles, and like in some video games, they'll highlight proper nouns or important plot points by coloring the text differently. So it's like everyone else gets that, but we get the audio only.
You really painted the picture of what the deficits in social communication is perfect for understanding. So the restricted repetitive patterns of behavior and interests and activities, can we talk maybe about what that looks like in someone who has autism?
Yeah, I don't really deal with this so much. I do deal with it, just not so much to a life-altering degree as other people on the spectrum do. And one of those bullet points right under that is the source of the repetitive movements and the inflexibility, which is hypo or hypersensitivity. Basically, autistic people's senses can be turned all the way up to 11 or all the way down to 0.
Wow.
So sometimes you might have an autistic person who has their smell turned down to 0 and their touch turned to 11. So they would avoid touching things and seek out smells to stimulate their sense of smell. And this is where stimming comes from.
That is so interesting. I never knew that the senses could be divided that way, that you could be feeling a certain sense stronger. That would be very distracting.
If your kid is hypersensitive to sound, they'll probably complain about the fluorescent lights buzzings, the fridge humming, and it distracting them. And if they're low touch sensitive, they'll just want to touch everything.
It's so fascinating to see, like how you could maybe recognize it if you suspect it in your child, or to see it in children who have it that are family friends, or just to be aware, especially in a young child. Like, kids love to touch anything anyway, but to realize that it can be a way for them to get to know their environment beyond just the normal. I think that's so good to be aware of.
Yeah, and where there are so many different dials, on all the different senses, and it looks different for everyone. And you're right, when it's with a little child, and children are learning to explore their world through their senses anyway, and trying to integrate all those senses together so that they make sense. They're all clunky about it. So sometimes it's difficult to know if this is typical development or not. One of the cues that we had before Brady was diagnosed was he fell off our porch one time into a rose bush. And I snatched him up and I prepared for him to scream and cry, and he didn't respond in the least. He just had this face on that looked like nothing had happened. And I just phew, that was a close one. I can't believe he didn't get hurt. And then when I put him down for his nap that afternoon and his shirt came up, he was just lacerated all over the place. He was just really injured. And he didn't process that sensory sensation, because in that moment, I guess he had turned that all the way down, maybe because it was too much.
Yeah. And this is not an at-will thing. This was just, it might be something subconscious. It might have been that I just had my touch sense dialed all the way down that day.
Yeah, I love that analogy, JaNae. When we spoke on the phone, you talked about like the different dials on like a stereo. You have the bass and you have the treble and you have the fade or whatever, all these different ones. And I think there's a misconception, as you said, that, we hear a lot of like high functioning autism, or they're just a little autistic, and you were saying how it's not a linear spectrum, that it's like a rainbow, right? And that there's ups and downs in different areas, and each individual person that is diagnosed with autism has their different dials set to different things. And so every person who is diagnosed with autism is unique to themselves, right? That you can't have two people. I mean, you may have two people that are very similar in what they're sensitive to and what they're not, or different things like that. But for the most part, it looks very unique in each individual, and that those specific dials are kind of what determines this is autism or it's not.
Yeah, it's a misnomer right now in our society. We say a lot of things like, he's a little bit autistic, or he's really autistic, or
Not possible.
not possible, or everybody has a little autism in them.
No.
Autism is autism. You have autism or you don't have autism. And even though there's a lot of...
Your autism might be very obvious, but that doesn't mean that you're low functioning or whatever.
Right. And you may be severely affected, but we even avoid the terminology high and low functioning, because it kind of paints that picture of people here. It's a spectrum disorder. So you're either on the low end of the spectrum or the high end of the spectrum.
Right.
And it's not like that. A spectrum is a rainbow with many colors, various shades of those colors. And that's what makes each person with autism so very unique.
It's not a white to black scale. It's a color picker.
Mm-hmm. Also, actually, on that topic, we talked about Aspergers also being something that they have integrated into the spectrum, and they consider it as part of the autism spectrum disorders as well.
Yes, it's integrated. And we still use the term sometimes.
Uh-huh.
We'll say somebody's Aspie, but it's not something that you'd be diagnosed with. You're either diagnosed on the autism spectrum or not.
So the other thing too is that autism is now, I think back 20 years ago, there was a lot about curing autism, right? There was this push to cure autism, and there's these different things you can do to cure autism. And I think we've come a long way till now where we say, this isn't something we need to cure. There's nothing wrong. It's different. And how have you seen that transition? Because you've had Brady for 25 years. So you've probably seen how the view on autism has changed drastically in the last 2 decades.
When Brady was first diagnosed, the numbers were more like 1 in 500 kids. So it was fairly rare. It wasn't unheard of, but it was kind of uncharted territory in most communities. And it was scary. And there was a big push to cure it. Families were mortgaging their houses. They were going into extreme debt to try every intervention possible, every medical intervention and every therapeutic intervention. And you would hear people often say, I've cured my child of autism, or my child is symptom free. And it's interesting now because a lot of those kids, when Brady was a kid, they're all young adults now, and they have this self-awareness about autism, and they're able to give us this perspective of, why are you trying to cure me?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I'm an individual. I see myself as fine. I've dealt with this all my life. It's a challenge, but the biggest challenge is people being jerks and not communicating well.
Brady has this great analogy about,
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so sometimes I'll call autism being mentally left-handed, because back in the 50s, 60s, if you wrote with your left hand, you would get a ruler across your wrist. Thankfully, that doesn't happen anymore. But autism is in a similar position to lefties back then. People don't like it, not because it's bad or harmful, simply because it's not what they're used to. And quite frankly, there are no left-handed scissors for us.
Brady's indicated before that a lot of the behaviors and meltdowns kind of symbolically come from living in a world with no left-handed scissors. The more we understand about autism, the more we're able to kind of tweak our world and our environment so that it's a friendlier, more inclusive community for everyone. And, regardless of their differing ways of socializing or communicating, there's a lot of secondary issues that come with autism. Depression and anxiety is a big one, but that's not autism. That may be a response to autism.
You'll often hear of people with autism and ADHD, autism and
intellectual disability. And there's some things like it's associated with a variety of disabilities. You'll see somebody with Down syndrome and autism, somebody with seizure disorders and autism, but those aren't features of autism. They may be secondary, or they may just be another primary disability that the person has.
Like you said, I think raising awareness is so important, because so much of the frustration that comes from people with autism is that there's no left-handed scissors, there's no understanding or awareness. And I think the more that we can spread that understanding and awareness that different isn't bad, right? That we can understand that, I feel like the more we can be accepting, and then the better they can thrive in the world. Brady, what would you say, what are you doing with your life right now? How do you feel like you've coped with it? And how has it affected you, or how did it affect you when you were young compared to now?
All right, I'll answer those questions one at a time, but you might have to. Right now, what I'm doing with my life is going to college, dealing with finals right now. I've dealt with all the big papers and all that, so that's a big relief. Hoping to one day become an instructional designer, which is the person who writes the curriculum or the textbook or the training videos. Basically, an instructional designer designs instructions.
When was the earliest time that you remember associating with an autism diagnosis?
I think I was around 10 when I first knew of the word autism. I think we had a workbook and I mentioned it at school once, but I was like, I don't know what this means. This is a word that apparently describes me. Okay, I'm still going to be the same person. And then I think it wasn't until like around high school or even later that I realized, oh, that's what this diagnosis means for me.
And the workbook that he mentioned was actually really cool. Like in 6th grade, we started talking about it. And I said at the time, Brady, have you ever heard the word autism? And he's like, oh, no, never heard of that before, which I thought was remarkable because it's probably the most spoken word in our home, especially at the time. But we had
in
this...
one ear, out the other. That's young.
He did not process that words that came into his sensory system. But we had this workbook that at the time kind of compared having autism to being a Mac, where most of the world was a PC. So these days we might say, compare an iOS system versus an Android. 2 different languages, nothing's wrong with either. There's strong opinions about both, but they both are very effective.
The issue is sometimes they don't talk nice to each other.
Yeah, they don't necessarily connect or speak the same language. And so all of our efforts are about creating, I don't know what the technical term would be, Brady, but
a translation language, I guess.
Yeah, so they can use the same apps and the same, talk to each other a little better. When Brady was just preparing to go to junior high, and I said, Brady, junior high is quite different. You go to 8 different classes and you have 8 different teachers, 8 different classrooms. You have the schedule, you keep your things in the locker. And this is all new to him. He said, do they have any classes for autism? And I said, they don't have classes for autism, but they do have classes for people who have autism and I was digging for a term that was positive. And before I could finish it, Brady said, other technological differences. And I said, yeah, that's exactly right. So he's never looked at it, I feel like, in negative terms.
No, never.
It's just different.
How does that diagnosis affect you now? And what are some of those challenges or opportunities?
It's kind of hard because I don't compartmentalize myself very well. I'm not like, okay, this is the part of me that likes chocolate, and this is the part of me that's autistic, and here is the line that divides them. Like, no, I'm just a person that's messy and complicated and whole. As for the challenges and opportunities, I don't think I've had to deal with too many challenges. I had to work in a call center, and that wasn't fun, but I don't think that's fun for most people. do have some opportunities, mainly thanks to some of the disability acts structures. Like, I could potentially get my college paid for through the government because I have autism, and when I get a full-time job, apparently I automatically qualify for FMLA to take time off because of my autism.
Yeah, there's a lot of tools in place.
But not enough.
It needs to be, but not enough. We're working towards it as a society.
What things can people do to help improve that?
I suppose the biggest thing that an average everyday person could do is talk to us. Because we are the experts on being us and what it's like being us. Like, there are hashtags for actually autistic, asking autistics. And there are communities there that, like any community on the internet, has its echo chambers, its jerks, its paragons, etc. But please talk with us. We're normal people. We want to tell you what it's like to be us.
One of Brady's catchphrases is, "There's no about us without us." And that's why I really wanted him to be a part of this podcast, because he is the expert. And the best awareness campaign we can run is just building relationships with one another, because you can read the facts and you can become educated on a topic, but until you meet a person and develop a relationship with that person, it's really difficult to know very much about whatever challenges they're facing.
So as his mother, I just sense throughout this interview a lot of love and pride for him. And I just am curious from your perspective. I mean, he's had his personal journey through autism, but it doesn't seem like it's really affected anything or changed him. You know, that's who he is. He is who he is, and he's been able to kind of take charge of his life despite how maybe society might look at it. So as his mom, on the flip side, how has it been like watching him, and even from the beginning? And tell us what that looked like for you from a mother perspective.
Okay, so going back to the very beginning, Brady was diagnosed really early, especially for the severity of his autism and how long ago it was. I think that we were just extraordinarily blessed. There were just a lot of things in place. My mom was a special educator. My dad was a vocational rehabilitation counselor, and disabilities and learning disabilities were just kind of part of our growing up. It was talked about very freely in our home, and we had people with disabilities in and out of our house a lot. When Brady was 2, he was a tough toddler. He was into everything like toddlers are, and I thought we were dealing with ADHD because he was just constantly on the move, and my house was constantly upside down. And it wasn't just normal messes. It was like just weird stuff. Like, one time I needed to prove what I do all day by not doing what I do all day. And so my poor husband came home from work and the house was upside down, and I just left everything the way Brady put it. And so, we had a big ficus tree standing in the middle of the kitchen, and everybody's beds were torn apart down to the mattress. Beds that were made. Sorry, Brady.
I mean,
we've come through it. But there were reasons that we went looking for a diagnosis, right? Our property was surrounded by a fence all the way around. That's why we bought it. The fence did not deter him for a second. It was like he just went straight for it and almost stepped right through it. He was over it so fast.
Oh my goodness.
And there were so many parts about raising him that, as I visited with other moms, it didn't really compare. There was this one time I was sitting in the park with my friend who had a little 2 or 3 year old that was Brady's age. And we both had our little girls in our car seats. And we were in the park, and we were watching the boys play. And I was sitting on the edge of the bench watching the boys like a hawk. And I could tell this mom was like, helicopter mom alert, like calm down. And she was trying to give me a little educating on the side. And she was like, isn't it nice that even when they run off, they come back and check in with us? And I was like, they do? I don't know about that. And I watched them go over this hill, and I kind of jumped up, and she looked at me like, just chill, lady. And I just started trucking over the hill. And sure enough, her little boy comes running back, and he's waving, hi, Mom, I'm still here. And I get to the other side of the hill, and Brady is heading straight for this busy street. No intention of stopping. And I grabbed him up, and I'm like dragging him back by his wrist. And I'm like, helicopter mom, my foot. I'm like, life flight mom. And I remember trying to discipline him, and somebody telling me, well, so-and-so puts their child on timeout and sits him right on the dryer. And I'm like, why would I put him on the dryer? I'm constantly pulling off the top of the fridge that he just somehow scaled in a nanosecond. Why would I put him where he can get into more trouble? Like, there is none of the usual advice ever applied. So I called my mom, and she said, yeah, that sounds like ADHD. And I think I knew from my schooling and from her experience that we weren't going to get a diagnosis anytime soon. But we had a friend who's actually my preschool teacher when I was growing up.
Oh, wow.
She created Kids on the Move, our early intervention.
Oh, yeah.
Here. And I took him, I gave them a call, and I said, I know you probably can't diagnose ADHD. And they said, just bring him down. So I took him, and I still remember this moment really well, because I'm walking towards the building, holding on to this wild toddler that's fighting as hard as he can to go the other direction, and trying to manage Amy's baby carrier in the other hand. And somebody was watching me from the window, and she came out, recognized my struggle, took the car seat and helped me and held open the door. She would never recall that moment, but for me, it was the moment that defined my first step into this world of managing a family with disabilities. And it was so welcoming, and I think it really set the tone. Anyway, so our experience with early intervention was very positive. And I think that may be one of the reasons that we've always been able to speak of disability in a positive light and not be afraid of it.
When maybe outsiders look at autism and consider it like a disability, or, have that kind of dark cloud over it that like we think we know and we don't actually know. And so I love that this podcast is really opening that understanding, like we mentioned. Do you consider autism to be a disability?
Well, so in our outline, I've linked a video to a storyteller called Kevin Kling, and right where it starts, he's talking about Dis and the city of Dis in Dante's Inferno, and he's talking about how Dis means through and our way, and is the preface for words like disability, and he says it doesn't mean inability, it means able through another way. So yes, in that definition, I do see it as a disability. Do I see it as a hindrance in my life? Only when people are being uncooperative, to use the most nice word.
There's something in your other way.
Yes.
Well, ever since we heard Kevin Kling tell his story, and he has disabilities himself, that definition just really resonated with us and our whole family, because we've never seen disability as a negative or something shameful or like something went wrong. It just means that we're doing life in another way. And if you have a child with autism, you're going to be doing life in another way. You're going to be going a different direction than maybe you had originally planned. And we really like the other way. It's delightful. It's not overpopulated. There's very lovely vistas, and sometimes we get to trailblaze, and sometimes it's very peaceful and private, and it's mostly a positive thing.
So you've kind of talked about that first step into early intervention. So what did that look like from then on? You had the testing done, and they came back with a diagnosis to you. Is that right? And then what were the steps you took after that?
Yeah, that was a fun day. They brought a whole team of people to my house. I think there were like 8 or 12 people sitting in my living room. and they all had these really sympathetic,
somber
faces on. And I remember they didn't even use the term in a sentence. They just all looked at me and somebody said, autism. And my first reaction was like, okay, that's an interesting twist. I didn't, it's your opinion, whatever. And I called my husband later that afternoon and I said, oh yeah, by the way, the team came by. They think Brady has autism. He's like, oh, that's interesting. And that was about as distressful as the diagnosis was for us, which I recognize is completely unusual. But for me, and I think this was just really divine, I don't know why this thought came to my mind at the moment, but it was, my very initial thought was, well, that's just a term. He's still Brady. I already knew that we had challenges. I already knew life was going to be different. Now we just have a name for it. And it hasn't changed anything about him. We already knew he was precocious and active and curious and unique and quirky. But anyway, so we remained in early intervention and we got really great support, a lot of education, and met a lot of people, and really became, for me, not for Brady at the time, but for me, became a member of that community. That is such a crucial, important piece of living life with a disability is to have a community that you belong to and be able to share stories, process information back and forth, and your unique emotional experiences that you're going to have, that you're not going to have conversations with your soccer mom friend or your mother-in-law maybe, but to be able to have those connections and those relationships with people who get it is vital.
A support network is key anytime someone has a disability. I've heard you guys talk about something similar to this when you were talking to a mother with her daughter with cystic fibrosis.
Yeah.
Yeah, so having a support network, key. And if possible, try and invite autistic adults into that network since, again, we are experts on being us.
How would you build that network for a mother who maybe has recently had a diagnosis of her child?
Yeah, so every area is going to have different offerings. You may, if you're in the birth to age 3 range, you probably have an early intervention program near you. Once you hit age 3, you have the public education system, which may or may not serve your purposes, but you'll find people there for sure. But yeah, you can Google resources in your area.
Facebook groups could be a useful tool.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of Facebook groups available.
So, JaNae, you seemed to really take the diagnosis in stride. And what would you say to somebody who felt more shaken when they did?
Yes, thank you.
That diagnosis for their kids.
It's such an important question because that is by far the common response is grieving and some trauma, some recognition that my life is now taking a much different course than I had planned. Usually there's a lot of educating to be done. My advice is to the moms and the dads and the entire families, allow yourself that time to grieve, that time to process that information. There's no shame in that. It's hard. It's real. And grieving is a necessary process, and you're probably not going to get to the next step unless you allow yourself that grieving time. But by all means, get to that next step. Do not wallow in the grieving for long. Take as long as is needed, which will be different for everybody. But by all means, get to the next step. And I think Brady wants to tell us why.
Yeah. So I think you asked me earlier about this is when you asked how I would have reacted differently if I had been diagnosed later in life. And I answered, it would depend on what I'd been told about autism and what my preconceptions are. And there are a lot of negative preconceptions out there. And I sympathize with grieving parents who have just received their diagnosis. As a person who has autism and doesn't see it as a problem, I don't get it, but I sympathize. But I'm asking you, parent who is listening to this, please don't post about your grieving on Facebook, specifically about autism, So you can say you're having a hard time, or that you're just not feeling happy right now. That's fine. But for the sake of the next parent who finds out that their child has autism, don't say that you are devastated by this diagnosis.
Yeah, and to take that further, I think this goes for anybody in our society, whether autism is a part of your life or not. It's all around you. The numbers are high. And
you've probably already met a person with autism.
Yes.
Might even be friends with them.
It might even be you.
Yeah.
But
I just keep thinking too that we never want someone or our children or anyone to feel like they're a burden for us. So I just keep thinking that whole time where, yeah, there's that grieving, that you're grieving a life you imagined in your mind, but life is never going to be the one that you imagined in your mind anyway. And so when we, like you say, wallow in that, we don't want to stay too long, because it helps. I don't know, it kind of makes other people feel like they're a burden on you, or you never want your kids, especially your kids, to ever feel that, you know?
Right. And as we communicate that, if we process that in the wrong places, like Brady said, like on social media,
Right.
it continues this misnomer that's out there that autism is a bad thing. It's something that we need to annihilate from our society. We need to find a cure. It's a burden on people. And a lot of people will come across those messages, and they may be associated with true emotions, but they're not true statements. Autism isn't something that we need to get rid of. It is pervasive. It is as much a part of a person as the color of their hair, even though that does change sometimes. We had this awesome experience one time when we invited Brady and 3 of his friends to be panelists in a class that this high school where we were teaching disability awareness. The kids, who were mostly freshmen and sophomores, put the questions together, and they asked all the raw questions that adults don't usually dare ask. And
we just hit them out of the park.
Out of the park.
Good.
It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. But they asked the question, if you could take a pill and wake up and not have autism tomorrow, would you do it? Every person on the panel responded, absolutely not.
I think some of us said that we might take a pill that helped deal with some of the symptoms. Like I talked earlier about how everyone else seems to have highlighted text under everything the other person says. If I could gain that ability, I think I would. But get rid of my autism altogether for the sake of that, I don't know who I would be.
And that's so enlightening for a mother who maybe has a diagnosis and just maybe feels this like negativity of like, oh, my poor son, he has this, to realize like, here's Brady and all these other adults that have autism and they would not take it away. That is huge to recognize and say, so don't project that onto your child, right? Like your child can thrive and they can be happy as they are. And I think that's such an eye-opening thing to hear that every single person said, absolutely not. This is who I am, you know?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I love that, Brady, you didn't even realize what autism was or that you had it until you were, I think it was 10 years old is what you said. And it goes to show how your family did such a good job of recognizing it's just you. It's just part of you, just like how my kids have different personalities and it's just you. I just love that.
Autistic people are human beings. We have the same foibles, strengths, weaknesses. They might not be the same as most people, but we have all of those things. And to go with what you were saying earlier, Erica, about how parents could take heart in how awesome I am, and that their child is in good company, they could also take heart in the fact that Dan Aykroyd, Ghostbuster, has autism. Shitoshi Shijiri, I probably butchered that, who founded this little IP, you might have heard of it, called Pokemon, has autism. Not officially diagnosed, but from what we know about him, Einstein probably was autistic. So there are a lot of awesome autistic people. It's just pop culture just does not portray us that way. And I think that's probably one of the main sources of this grief that people have to go through when they realize that their child has autism.
That's so true. Let's jump over to education. I know that you were saying with autism that you're doing things a different way. So that often means trailblazing, and trying new things, and that probably the standardized school system, which already is not really great for a good chunk of kids without autism. I'm sure with autism, it makes it even that much. You probably had to trailblaze a lot. So I'd love to hear, how did you approach their education in a way that fit their needs?
So we started off, Brady went to a regular mainstream kindergarten. I was with him a lot. He probably doesn't remember. And after that, for the rest of his elementary school years, he had an aide. And most of his elementary school years, I was learning to get into the driver's seat of his education, which took me longer than I think it should. But I had some experiences early on where his education just fell apart. And he had some really amazing teachers, but he had some kind of crazy administrators here and there that didn't know much about autism, didn't know Brady at all, and wanted to just try out
New innovative policies.
Yes. Yeah. And without going into the nitty-gritty, gory details, I found myself at one point with an administrator who put this whole team together, and Brady was like in first or second grade, blocked his aide from any decision making. So didn't let the people who knew him best be part of the decision, and wrote this crazy behavior program where they asked me to sign a paper giving permission to spray him in the face with a water bottle whenever he acted out.
Like a dog.
Surely this will work.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And their reasonings were he's just trying to get attention or whatever. Brady has
I never understood that phrase.
right. I know. If you know beans about autism, you know there's no effort even understanding of what it means to try to get attention.
And we are so very blunt. We have zero hidden agendas. We will
there's no
put our heart on our sleeves and let you know what exactly we want and how much we want to talk to you about whatever we love.
The ultimate WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get.
Yeah, there's no manipulation there or trying to,
It's so awesome. But anyway, this experience it was as awful as it was. It woke me up to the reality that somebody's got to be driving this bus, and it's going downhill fast. And it's because I wasn't in the driver's seat. Not only was I welcome to be in the driver's seat of my kids' education, it was expected because nobody else is driving it. And I think that's the case whether you have a disability or not. Our education systems are there as a tool for parents to use in their responsibility of educating their children. And so that's when I really started realizing that I'm the one that's calling the shots here. And well, at that point, we changed schools and got
because, oh boy, that principal.
Yeah. So we got some better advocates on our team, people that understood him a little bit more and respected my role on his education team and respected his unique ways of learning. But even still, as he was approaching junior high is like a shipwreck for any kid, right? And I started exploring some other avenues. It was actually one of Amy's teachers through the School for the Deaf, who at the same time I was having really unique education experiences with her, and had this amazing School for the Deaf teacher who kind of coached me and mentored me in being the bus driver of my kids' education, right? And so she pointed me in a few directions, and we ended up working with the child development specialist who wrote programs for us every quarter, and then we would deliver this education program. And as much as I could, I would try to get the school to adopt that, and if they wouldn't, then we would just do it on our own. And so we started doing a lot of homeschooling combined with other programs. So I think Brady's first year in 7th grade, he had like 1 or 2 classes at the school, and then we homeschooled the rest. And it worked out actually pretty well. He had not a positive junior high experience, but not a negative one. We weren't dealing with bullying and things like that. So I'll tell you one funny story. When he was just starting 7th grade, clean slate, new team, nobody knew him. They hadn't received any of his paperwork yet. just curious to see how obvious his autism is and not tell any of his teachers right off and see what they notice. So we went to back to school night, which was before school started. We walk into the Spanish class that he was going to take. There's parents milling around and there's new 7th grade students and everybody's kind of nervous and meeting the new teacher. We're standing in line waiting to talk to this teacher. And this teacher had a huge love sack, like a giant beanbag pillow, right, in his room. And it was right next to his desk. And Brady's walking around the room and he suddenly sees this pillow and his eyes just get huge and he backs out the room, all the way out the door, down the hall, so he can get a good run at it. And he comes like sprinting into the room, this big flying flop right into the middle of this bag. Like so much freedom, right? And everybody just stops talking and they look at him and they look at me and I'm like frozen. And I go, autism.
Well, that plan went well.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not going to try to hide it anymore. But anyway, we walked down the hall after that, and I see all of these kids with their new school outfits and looking around for friends, and they're all nervous. And I remember this feeling myself when I was in junior high, just kind of a really, it's part of development, but it's the most self-centered stage of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're so turned into yourself and so nervous about all of the social elements that you're about to face. And I was like, Brady's going to be just fine. Like, he's impervious to all of these challenges. But I wouldn't say that he learned a lot academically. The specialist that we were working with just kept saying to me over and over, you just need to turn Brady onto learning and everything's going to be fine. Just turn him onto learning. And I was like, blah, blah, blah. What does that even mean? And how do I do that? Right? Anyway, so we opted for a private school for high school. And we have a special needs scholarship here that we're so fortunate to have so that we're able to pay for a private education at this awesome school that didn't have any special ed services at all, but they gave us all the autonomy we needed. And so we hired our own aides, and it was a much smaller school, a lot less socially overwhelming. He really started to turn on to learning there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. In junior high, I would say my prevailing thought was, I can't wait to get home to see if any of my magazine subscriptions have come in, over and over and over in my head.
And I thought he was anxious to come home to see me, but
yeah. I mean, you're nice.
But I'm no Pokemon magazine.
Yeah. But when I went to high school, I was like, oh, English, history, science, and actually thinking about those instead of just counting the minutes till it's time to go home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so he really turned on to learning there, and he was well known at the school. They knew, all of his classmates knew he was that really smart kid. Grades weren't a big focus at that school. Learning was actually the focus. And so it was a really great environment for him. And I wouldn't say he was the popular kid at school, but he was definitely the famous kid at school. Everybody knew him and knew Brady. And I don't know if Brady knew that anybody there had names. Right?
I still have like 3 or 4 names of people that I knew.
Yeah. From that point on, once he was turned on to learning, I could really just step back. And
I was in the driver's seat of the bus.
Yeah, that's when Brady got in the driver's seat, and it was really nice. And he continues to just be a sponge and learn everything that he can possibly get access to. So about 2 years after high school, right, Brady attended this school called Scenic View Academy, which we absolutely love. And it's a transition school for young adults and adults with autism, with high functioning autism. And their goal is to completely integrate these young adults into their communities.
Yeah. To take an autistic person living at home to an autistic person living independently.
Yep. And so their whole first term is just evaluations and getting to know each other. And then their classes are all about how to do life autism style and how to self-advocate in the community.
How to deal with the apartment rental, how to budget, how to find work.
And every student has their therapist
and a coach
and an employment specialist and a school specialist. They get lots and lots of one-on-one time. They have dorms there on campus, so they first learn to live on their own with the help of, the cafeteria and residence assistants and things like that, just like in college. Mm-hmm. And then they move into apartments there on campus, learn to do their own cooking and everything. And then eventually they're living out in the community in an apartment somewhere. And once they're pretty independent, that's when graduation happens. So when Brady graduated, he was living in this really sweet apartment, actually. It was really nice. And had a job, had a car, and was completely taking care of all of his own needs, cooking and shopping and advocating for himself with school and everything else. There are probably other schools like it across the country, but this is a school that anybody in the country can attend.
I just think it's so amazing that they have those. I mean, this is an example of left-hand scissors, right? In the community, in the world, to be able to say, hey, we got you and we're going to help you be able to fit into society that, maybe didn't let you fit in before. So I think that is such a great resource for those who maybe have older children, or to look forward to if you do have children, as far as like after high school, a resource that they could turn to.
And more resources are popping up all the time. Wherever you live, there will be more resources when your child is an adult as there are right now. So we're moving in good directions. I did a lot of advocating for him when he was in high school, but as a young adult, he still needs advocating, but he's become a self-advocate, and he has an autism academic coach at college that...
If you have any college-age kids and they offer academic coaches, take them.
Yeah, so he sits down with his coach 2 to 3 times a week, and they just go over his classes.
What needs to get done? When am I going to do it? Very useful stuff.
Time management, how to communicate to professors about his autism and what kind of academic challenges might come up because of that. And I have nothing to do with it anymore. He completely drives his own bus.
I think that's really telling of your example, though, of taking charge too. I think that you really set the tone for Brady to have a model to work after, just from even viewing a disability the way that you view it and how you portrayed it in the home has helped him have this view of it differently than maybe another parent or someone else, in society or something. And then also just with this education of saying, like, we're going to take charge and we're going to do it the way that it works for us. And we're going to find the resources that we need. We're going to find the scholarships that we need. We're going to find the schools that are going to be willing to work with us. And you've set that example that now Brady is an adult. He's able to follow, I think, your model. And so it really says a lot about how involved you were. And I think, through your story, I think it can show a lot of parents that are kind of early on in this, that like, hey, get in that driver's seat, do those things, look for those programs. There's so many resources out there. And I'm guessing a lot of them don't get tapped into because people just don't look for them.
Yeah. And you know what? I would say get in that driver's seat and then drive safely. I see a lot of parents who are, quote unquote, advocating for their child, and they're just driving recklessly, demanding and burning bridges. And being
sometimes
angry.
It's advocating for their children while advocating for themselves that's disguised as advocating for their children.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you are, for instance, advocating for your child to get an A in every class, you might be advocating for yourself. I had early on a friend shared with me a perspective from a friend, hers, that I'd never met, but she said she's so good at just using what the school system has to offer that works for her and not being upset about what they don't offer. I was like, oh, that's the kind of parent I want to be educated on what they offer and what fits for us, and not get all up in a dither about the things that they can't.
Do get up in a dither in things that they should.
Yes. Yeah. If, no disability law, no special education law, and kindly demand that they provide what they're supposed to provide. Their job is not to raise our children. It's not really even to take charge of educating our children. Their role, of course, is to educate children, but it's ultimately us as parents. We provide an education for our children, and the school system, whether it's the public school system or anything else that you use, is resources that we use to accomplish that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that goal that they gave you the advice of turning your child on to learning. I feel like that's a really good goal for, I think, all parents to have, is that our goal is not that our child gets straight A's, but we want to turn them on to learning, that they love learning and they want to learn, because that's what's really going to help them in the future, right? Getting straight A's but hating learning is not going to get you anywhere. But if you can teach them to be excited about learning and pursue something that they're interested in, that can help them find a career that they want and kind of move forward from there in life. So I think that's, I would say, probably like the best educational goal to have.
Right? Yeah.
All right, we just have a few more questions. How has having autism in your life changed the way that you think, changed the way that you view the world, and maybe your life goals in general?
Can I answer that kind of in terms of disability? Because my other, in our home, we have autism, a child that's deaf, severe developmental disability. We have very severe anxiety and depression. I didn't know that parenthood for me was going to be about raising children with disability. And I love it, actually. I love autism. And I love, like I said before, going down a different path. I find it prettier. and like Brady doesn't know what life is like without autism. I don't know what parenting is like without autism and the other disabilities that we deal with. I remember a time early on, I was invited to be part of a district focus group. There were a whole bunch of parents and there was professionals there leading the discussion. And the whole evening was just angry and a lot of contention and
woe is me.
Yeah, a lot of finger pointing and blaming. And we really accomplished nothing in that meeting. It went on and on. At one point, people started to get up to leave. And the woman who was running the meeting said, "We're not going to let anybody leave this room until everyone's answered this one question. Tell me one gift that your child with a disability has given you." And just like that, the whole feeling in the room turned on a dime. We started going around the room and people were saying, "I just find that I'm a lot more patient with everybody." Or "I find that I don't judge people like I used to." Or "I have a lot more compassion that I didn't used to have." And as we went around the room, I'm like, everybody's taking everything that I wanted to say. As we came around the circle, I realized what they're describing is charity. And I realized that there's probably nothing we want to leave this earth with more than charity. And I realized that any amount of it, a large amount of it that I've been able to develop in my life, was a direct result of raising my children in a different way. And they have brought so many people into my life, including Erica. We wouldn't have ever connected without going down this path. So many amazing people, so many wonderful relationships, wonderful discussions like this, new perspective on life, finding the best parts in life in the most unfathomable places. I love everything that my kids have given me.
I love that. Any final messages that you'd like to share?
One, remember that your child is a human being. They will develop on their own, and you can't really control what they become, but you can become how healthy they are in that. My mom said that at one point that raising a child is like raising a plant, and I changed that to raising a child is like taking care of a bed of wildflower seeds. You can't control what comes up, but you can control how well it grows. Yeah. And secondly, again, talk to us. We are people. We want to help you and help you understand what it's like to be autistic. And three, for reasons I will not go into, don't listen to Autism Speaks, please. There is a link to a video in the outline to why, but someone already covered it, so I won't.
He has some strong opinions about that. I just heard this today in one of the podcasts that Brady linked, a Johnny Cash quote. He said, God gave us our talents, but it's our limitations that give us our style. I love Brady's style. I love the style of people who are doing life a different way, because it's like the definition of cool, I think.
I know. I definitely look at you, Brady, and just think, man, like I wish I didn't always get caught up on what other people thought, or, you know, like what's in, like, do I look good for everybody else? And just, you know, like you have this confidence in yourself. You don't really care what anybody else thinks. You're just going to blaze your trail. And I envy you that you're able to do that so naturally. And so it's okay to be different. It's good to be different, because I think that people can learn from your example. And so I'm so glad that you guys got to come on and talk with us today. And hopefully for those of you listening, this has been a great opportunity to kind of have your eyes opened to autism and to disability in general, and realize that these can be things that bless our lives and really enrich our lives in a way that nothing else could. So thank you so much for being on, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Motherhood Tribe.